Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo published game. Welcome to the next episode. The next games are Mach Rider and Versus Mach Rider. This time we've got another game that released on both the NES and the Versus system in 1985. Hold on though, why am I saying that there are 3 games in the title and thumbnail? Nintendo doesn't talk about this one a whole lot nowadays, so there's a lot of hazy information regarding exactly what's going on with this game, so let me do my best to explain what I know. Back in 1972, before Nintendo even started making video games, Nintendo made a toy that was called Mach Rider. This toy lets you launch a race car forward off of a motorized launch pad. Considering that this looks nothing like the biker in the Mach Rider video game, it doesn't really seem like Nintendo took much inspiration from this toy, besides the name itself. Fast forward to November of 1985, and Nintendo released the Famicom version of Mach Rider in Japan, and this release date comes directly from Nintendo's own website on the game. Additionally, the game was developed by HAL Laboratory, which makes sense since it seems to use the same raster-scrolling engine from F1 Race. We know HAL Laboratory worked on at least this version of the game because Iwata specifically said so in an interview. I think it is likely that they worked on the Versus system version too, as we can see their handprints all over it, such as the fact that the music was done by a HAL employee, and because we can see references to the team in the preset leaderboard. Despite the 1985 release date of the Famicom version in Japan, this game wouldn't end up seeing an NES release in the US until June of the next year. Now, so far, this all makes sense. However, when we start taking a deeper dive into Versus Mach Rider, things get a little more confusing. First off, 2 versions of the arcade game have been found, each focusing on a different mode from the NES version. As such, I've titled both of these variations off of which mode they are based on, with one being the Fighting Course version and the other being the Endurance Course version. I've seen claims online that the Fighting Course version was the Japanese variant and the Endurance Course version was the US variant. However, I can't really find anything concrete to back this claim up, so I'm not really sure if this is actually the case. In fact, in a Western flyer that contains an advertisement for the game, we can see that it shows the Fighting Course version and not the Endurance Course version. Of course, this could just be that the advertisement grabbed a screenshot from the Japanese version, so I'm still not really sure. Although these 2 variations could probably be considered the same game, I decided to play both versions and count them as separate games. Now, things get even more complicated once we start looking at the release dates for the Versus system version. The flyer from Nintendo that I showed before states that the US version of Versus Mach Rider also came out in November of 1985, which initially made me think the Versus system version essentially came out at the same time as the Famicom version. However, the release date for the arcade version in Japan is a bit more complicated since there's no flyer from Nintendo with the release date for this one. The list of Nintendo products page on Wikipedia says it came out in 1985 in Japan, which isn't all that specific, so initially I just stuck with the November release date for all 3 titles. However, after I dug more into Wikipedia's source, the Japanese Game Machine magazine, we can see that the game is mentioned as early as August of 1985. After doing more digging, I found that this actually lines up with the US copyright filing for the Mach Rider IP, which states that the initial date of publication was August 27th of 1985. What this means is that it is likely that Versus Mach Rider was actually the first version of the game released in Japan, and not only did I play these games slightly out of order, I should have played the Versus system version a bit earlier on in the challenge, which is why we're seeing the summary video now instead of after Super Mario Bros. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's take a look at my time with Mach Rider. Since I didn't initially realize that the arcade version had probably been released first, I started with the NES version, so that's what we will start off with here. This one has 4 different modes, although I mostly focused on the Fighting Course as the main mode. The Fighting Course is a mode that has a story and a set number of stages to complete, so I made beating those 10 stages my main objective. The game takes place in the year 2112, where aliens have invaded Earth. You are someone named Mach Rider, and your mission is to destroy the enemies and search for survivors. While this is what the story claims, the only real objective you have is to make it to the end of each level, as destroying enemies is optional, and you never actually see any survivors in the game. At first, you must choose a path. Basically, there are 2 variants of each stage, and you get to choose which one you play on. As I learned more about each stage while I played the game more and more, I eventually just chose the paths that I found the easiest. Now, I have played this one briefly before, and my memories of this game were that it was really difficult. Immediately on my first attempt, I went too slow, which caused someone to crash into me from behind. Whoops. Then, while I was trying to figure out how the gear shifting worked, someone crashed into me again, and I exploded a second time. You don't have any actual life for the very first stage, and instead you have energy that slowly goes down while you play. Getting into a crash makes it decrease a sizable amount, and if it runs out completely, you lose. Strangely enough, it's just the first stage that has this mechanic, as you simply have lives for the rest of the game from here on out. How much energy you have at the end of this first stage will actually determine how many lives you get for the rest of the game too, so it's important that you do as well as you can here. The problem is that it is super easy to blow up in this game. There are barrels along the side, and going off course and hitting these causes an immediate explosion. As I showed before, going too slow also causes an explosion, and additionally, there's oil and water everywhere, which makes it super easy to lose control and fly off to the sides. There's other racers you'll see along the way too, and they'll often try to bump you off the sides as well. You can destroy them with a gun, although you have a limited number of shots. Bullets can be refilled by bonking the enemy cars into the barrels yourself, but this wasn't super easy for me at first, so it's not something I initially focused on. My first attempt was awful. After all those explosions, I didn't even make it to the goal and I lost on level 1. Ouch. Running out of lives takes you back to the title screen, which is pretty brutal. The game doesn't give you any sort of continues or anything either. Well, sort of, but more on that later. On my next run, I made it past level 1 this time, and I had enough energy for 3 extra lives. Level 2 introduces a new type of obstacle, rocks. These are placed all over the middle of the stage, and, you guessed it, running into one of these blows you up immediately. These things are awful, especially on sharp turns. It really doesn't seem like you can react to these half the time, and going too slow to try and make it easier will just result in someone coming up behind you and crashing into you. I really can't stress enough just how awful all these obstacles on the road are. Somehow though, I made it to the end of stage 2 with only 1 extra life remaining. This next level introduced a handful of new mechanics too. The first of these were barrels on the road, which basically acted like the rocks, although they can be destroyed with your gun. They also introduced purple enemies, which fly up from behind and knock you around like crazy. These got really annoying at times, as it was pretty easy to just fly into the barrels all of a sudden because of them. There's actually 6 different tiers of enemies, and there's a graph in the manual that describes how difficult each of them are. Generally, each require more shots to destroy as you move further right on the graph. Another new mechanic in this one was that a section of the stage was covered in snow, which just made it a bit harder to control. Finally, they introduced these terrible sphere things the manual calls bomber balls. These things are awful. I think they're moving towards you, so they come up much faster than anything else in the game. While you can destroy them with your gun, they are so fast that you often have so little time to actually shoot them. While I did lose 1 life to them, I thankfully made it to the end with 0 extra lives remaining. With every 3 stages you beat, you get an extra life, so thankfully I got another one after this. Somehow, I beat level 4 without losing any lives. This is honestly going a bit better than I thought, although I imagine it will only get worse from here on out. It turns out, while the game doesn't give you any continues, the game actually lets you start from stage 6 if you have beaten stage 5 and enter in a code while you start the game. What this means then is I'm only 1 stage away from reaching that checkpoint. Unfortunately, I ran into a car and blew up immediately at the start of stage 5. It turns out that if you hit any car while moving slow enough, you'll blow up, not just the cars that sneak up from behind. I pretty quickly lost my last life after this too, and it was all over. Bummer, I didn't make it to stage 6. At this point, I decided to see what the endurance mode was like. This mode is endless, and with each stage, you have to make it far enough in a time limit. Each stage requires you to go further and further, and it ends if you ever fail to make it far enough. After a single run of this, I already beat the preset high score, and since it was endless, I decided to be done with it and see what the solo course was. As far as I could tell, this was just the same thing as the endurance course, just without the other racers as obstacles. After this, I switched back to the fighting course. Unfortunately, my next attempt went a bit worse than the previous one, and I lost my last life on level 4 this time. I kept trying though, and on the next run after, I think I lost my last life to the same exact turn from the previous run. Man, this game is just so tough. It's definitely one of my hardest games up until this point. I can't even get to the checkpoint at halfway, and it'll probably only get worse on the later levels. However, after a ton of tries, I finally managed to beat stage 5. Progress, finally. I lost my last life on stage 6, but I can continue back from this point from here on out. Or at least I should have been able to. I apparently took too long to enter the code, so I was back to level 1. Ugh. After a couple more tries, I had another good run going, and this one actually went super well. I made it all the way past stages 6 and 7 on this run, meaning I was only 3 stages away. Unfortunately, I lost my last life to one of those bomber balls. It's too bad that I didn't make it all the way here, but this is a good sign. Maybe starting from stage 6 will be enough to get me through this one. Unfortunately, I somehow failed to enter the continue code, and I was back at the start again. Come on, does this thing even work? Anyway, my time with the game was over for the day, so I put this one to rest for a bit. While I was away, I did some research and found something important. This game apparently has some very obscurely hidden power-ups in the game, and one of these is super good. These have really weird unlock conditions, and they typically involve destroying the exact right amount of a specific object on a stage to obtain it. The most OP power-up was one that made you impervious to most obstacles in the game. Once you had this power-up, the only things that could hit you were the barrels on the sides, those pesky bomber balls, and the other racers. If you end up losing a life while you have a power-up, you lose it, so it's not like it becomes completely free once you get this. Unfortunately, this particular power-up was also pretty tough to get. You had to destroy exactly 3 barrels on the sides with your gun and end the level with over 180 bullets. What this means was that you had to push a ton of guys into the barrels to actually get enough bullets to obtain the power-up. This turned out to be annoyingly tough to get. I spent a handful of runs resetting the first stage over and over trying to get it. However, I did eventually get it and my colors changed to red and blue. Man, this power-up is so nice. No more randomly crashing into rocks on sharp turns. I tried to get some of the other power-ups, which give you infinite bullets and one-shot kills on everything, but at this point, I didn't really think they were worth the risk of losing the invincibility power-up, so I didn't try all that hard to get them. While this power-up was super helpful, I unfortunately lost it on level 6 while trying to dodge the bomber balls. Bummer. Oh well, at least I made it to the checkpoint, assuming it actually exists. The run ended on stage 8, but I finally figured out how to do that stupid continue code, so I could start back from stage 6 as many times as I wanted. Man though, these final levels were super tough. I tried again and again from level 6 using the continue code, and I just could not make it. On a few attempts, I even made it all the way to stage 10, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't do it. The stages were a little too difficult at this point to get that power up too, so if I wanted to get it again, I would need to start over from the beginning. Eventually, I decided I would just restart from the beginning, but I'd use all the knowledge I'd played up until this point to write down the path that had the lowest number of bomber balls, since they were the primary threat to losing the power-up. After resetting, I actually got the power-up pretty quickly, but I stupidly lost it soon after moving too slow and getting exploded from the back. What a dumb mistake. Eventually, I got the power-up again, and this time I didn't blow up immediately. Unfortunately, a car bumped me into a barrel on stage 7 and I lost it again. Dang, after all that effort too. While this may make it seem like I'm all the way back to my previous attempts at the second half of the game, there was one key difference here. I had a ton more lives than usual for the last 3 stages. I ended up doing good enough that I reached the final level with 3 lives still remaining, which was more than I ever had before. At first, I was doing pretty good, but then I lost all 3 of my extra lives right near the end. Oh no, please, not like this. Thankfully, after some careful weaving around the obstacles, I clutched it and I finally beat stage 10. Beating all 10 stages is actually kind of lame. There's no ending cutscene or anything. It just sends you back to stage 1 and you see the opening cutscene again. You may notice that the stages here are different too, and that's because once you beat it once, you play on hard mode for the next run. It doesn't actually change the ending or anything though, so I was satisfied with just beating the full game once. Phew, what a doozy. Unfortunately for me, I'm gonna have to do it all over again on the Versus System version, and often these versions are even harder, so I went into this pretty nervous. Because of how much I dreaded doing the fighting course again, I started with the endurance course. This one is basically the same thing as the endurance mode from the NES game, just with a different opening scene before each level and a preset leaderboard. Because the game is endless, I decided my goal was to reach the top of the leaderboard, which meant I needed to beat HAL itself for that top place. This mode is super similar to the NES game, although you'll notice a lot of visual glitches on the road. This definitely has something to do with the method I'm using to play these games, and I wasn't able to figure out how to fix it, so unfortunately we'll just have to deal with it. Just know it's not an issue with the game itself. There's honestly not a whole lot to talk about with this one. On my first run I got 3rd place, but on my second run I did so bad I didn't even make the leaderboard. Ouch. My 3rd run went super great though, and I got that top position on the leaderboard. Nice. With that, the endurance course version of Versus Mach Rider was already complete. Oh boy, here we go. Time to do the fighting course all over again. At first, it seems like my fears would come to pass. There were way more obstacles on stage 1, which meant that not only was this version harder, but getting that power up on stage 1 would be even more difficult too. However, I kept going just to see how far I could make it on my own first. It went by incredibly fast, but after beating the stage, a few chunks of a sprite are loaded in. I didn't know what this was at first, but at the end of each stage, more and more of the identity of Mach Rider is revealed. Unfortunately, I lost all my lives by the end of stage 3, but then something incredible happened. The game lets you continue at the cost of more quarters right where you left off. While I can't help but feel like the difficulty here was made with the intention of eating more of your quarters, it doesn't cost me a dime, and it means I can go all the way to the end without having to restart once. Phew, my fears were all for nothing. This is going to be so much easier than the NES version. I game overed a bunch along the way, but it didn't matter. I reached stage 10 and saw the identity of Mach Rider. Apparently, HAL pulled the Samus-esque reveal before Metroid had even done it. Kinda wild. There's actually a lot of debate on whether or not this is actually Mach Rider, or if this is even canon at all. Both the manual and the trophies from Smash Bros. Refer to Mach Rider as a male, but they did the same thing for Samus in the US manual of Metroid, and it wouldn't be the first time the English trophy writers got something wrong in Smash. Admittedly though, it's a bit strange that this cutscene was completely removed from the NES version, although maybe it was due to size constraints or something, since that version had more modes. Keep in mind too, it does appear that the Versus System version was made first, so it seems like Mach Rider's female identity was their intention from the start. Anyway, since this game was so much easier, I decided to do hard mode too and see if there was anything special. The only change was that the palette for Mach Rider's true identity was a bit different for some reason. Beating hard mode just sends you back to the beginning again too, so with that, the fighting course version of Versus Mach Rider was complete. On to the reviews. Man, this is one where the overall difficulty definitely got in the way of my enjoyment of the game, although more specifically, it felt like this one just had way too many unreactable scenarios, which made a lot of the deaths feel really cheap. It's possible it wouldn't have been so bad if I figured out how to manage the speed better, but I wasn't able to find anything that worked. There's some good ideas to be had here, so it's not all bad, I just wish I didn't have to worry about suddenly blowing up to a random obstacle at every turn. I gave each version of the game a 5 out of 10. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.